For more than 40 years, police were searching for a killer. He had attacked people in their homes. He had murdered families. He had left DNA behind. And yet, he disappeared. For decades, nobody knew who he was. What makes this story even more disturbing is that the man eventually identified as the killer wasn't hiding in some remote place. He was living an ordinary life in California. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. And this is the story of the Golden State Killer. It began in California in 1970s. At first, police didn't even know they were dealing with the same person. A series of burglaries and sexual assaults began terrifying communities around Sacramento. The attacker would enter people's homes at night. He would study the neighborhoods. He would watch the victims, and he became known as the East Area Rapist. The fear spread quickly. People were so frightened that some residents began sleeping with weapons and taking extra precautions to protect their homes. The FBI later described the community as being terrified by what was happening. But the attacks didn't stop. They became more violent. In 1975, a college instructor named Cloud Snelling was killed when he confronted an intruder who was attempting to abduct his teenage daughter from her bedroom. And eventually, the crimes expanded beyond the Sacramento area. The attacker moved south through California. Murderers followed. Couples were attacked inside their own homes. Families were left devastated. Investigators began connecting cases that had happened in different cities in different countries. But there was a problem. They didn't know the killer's identity. For years, he remained a mystery. The case eventually became one of California's most notorious unsolved investigations. The killer was given different names as investigators connected more crimes to the same person: East Area Rapist, original Night Stalker, and eventually the Golden State Killer. By the time the attacks ended in 1986, investigators believed the same offender was responsible for dozens of sexual assaults and multiple murders. The FBI later said the crimes included 12 homicides, 45 rapes, and more than 120 residential burglaries. Then, nothing happened. The attacks stopped, but the case didn't. Investigators kept the evidence, and one piece of evidence would become incredibly important decades later: DNA. The killer had left biological evidence behind. Scientists could use that DNA to establish that crimes were connected. But there was still one problem. They knew what the killer's DNA looked like. They just didn't know whose DNA it was. Then technology changed. Investigators eventually turned to genealogy. Instead of searching only for an exact match, investigators could look for distant relatives of the person whose DNA had been recovered. That created a family tree. And slowly, the enormous search began to shrink. Investigators eventually focused on Joseph DeAngelo, and they still needed to prove it. Police secretly collected DNA connected to DeAngelo. One sample was obtained from his vehicle while he was shopping. Another came from discarded material outside his home. The DNA matched evidence from the crimes. After more than 4 decades, the mystery finally had a name. Joseph DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California on April 24, 2018. He was 72 years old, and there was another shocking detail. DeAngelo had once been a police officer. That meant the man who had spent decades evading investigators had himself worked in law enforcement. For the families who had spent decades waiting for answers, the arrest was enormous. A case that had seemed almost impossible to solve had finally been broken. In 2022, DeAngelo pleaded guilty. He admitted responsibility for 13 murders and numerous other crimes. Prosecutors said the crimes involved 87 victims in 53 separate attacks across 11 California counties. On August 21, 2022, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He finally stood before many of the people whose lives he had been destroyed. And after listening to victims speak, he apologized. But an apology couldn't undo decades of fear. It couldn't bring back the people who had been murdered. And it couldn't give the survivors back the years they had lost. What makes this case so terrifying isn't only what happened in those homes, it's what happened afterwards. For more than 40 years, people had no idea who the person responsible was. The killer had disappeared into ordinary life, and the case remained unsolved until science, persistence, and DNA technology finally caught up with him. The Golden State Killer case is also a reminder of something important. A case can go cold, but cold doesn't always mean forgotten. Evidence can survive for decades, technology can change, and sometimes the smallest piece of evidence can eventually become the thing that identifies the person everyone has been searching for. After 4 decades, the Golden State Killer was finally caught. And the man who had spent years hiding behind an ordinary life would spend the rest of his life in prison, even though he had lived enough free without any guilt of what he did. And the years he would spend aren't that much because he was old when he was arrested. That was all for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please leave a follow for Off Script and click the bell to always catch up with the latest videos I post. Thank you so much once again, and see you in the next episode. Bye.